Good morning, everyone. I think Professor Reimers deserves another round of applause for that extremely engaging sharing. And I think I haven't seen so many notebooks out and everybody dribbling and taking pictures of every single slide. And I think it's also because not just of the wealth of experience and also the perspectives that you share, but also I think the resonance that everybody here has in terms of what we feel, what we need to do in order to advance education for the nation and also for advancing teacher leadership. So I'd like to open the floor and also share the fact that I think, of course, I think everybody here is looking very much forward to ask Professor Reimers questions and also things, and perhaps you have half thoughts that you are simmering as you're listening to the professor sharing. But I also like to invite the space to share that there's also a wealth of perspectives here from leaders from the Ministry of Education, from civil society organizations, foundations, and teachers, of course, and we want those voices to be heard and to be shared in this space as well. So perhaps I'd like to open for anybody. You could use your traffic lights. If you have a reflection that you like to pose, if you can use your green card. If you have a half thought, you don't know what to do with it, but it's a question that you have that you want to throw out there, please use your yellow card. If you have a challenge or a provocation that you want to throw out to the room, the red card is at your disposal. So, if anybody would like to kick us off. Mariana. You can press the button in front of you that should project your voice to the entire room. Yes.
Oh, wow.
Part of the reason why we chose this place.
Sport education and mental well-being in children in Malaysia. I have two questions. The first one is, in your experience, Professor Reimers, how have you seen teacher well-being as a key component for change? Because we talk a lot about teachers providing for students, teachers as change makers, teachers as transforming systems, but I feel in my heart as a non-educator here, so this is probably the worst comment, is that they need support as well. The load is tough, the stress of handling classrooms, the conditions of schools, the curriculum, the pressures of performance. So how have you seen any best practice of any country or any school where you see that taking care of our teachers is a massive change for the outcomes of children? That's my first question. And the second is from a sports love that I have, and is how can we create more active children in schools? How can we encourage more physical activity outside just the PE curriculum, but how to create school to be a more playing place for children that will then create more engagements to go to class, to be happier, also very well-being focused, Professor. Sorry, those are my two questions to you.
Thank you, Mariana, for those two good questions. The first one, actually, I thank you because I should have said, in summarizing the two studies, that one of the findings, one of the consistent findings of these two studies in which we examine programs that had demonstrated success at building the capacity of teachers to educate the whole child, is that they themselves were helping these teachers develop not only their cognitive skills, but develop social emotionally. Nobody can teach what they haven't lived, what they don't have. And so, for example, if you want teachers to create psychological safety in a classroom in which people can take risks and so on, they need to have experienced that themselves. Now, that is not necessarily the same thing as well-being. I'll come to the second piece, but it's a very important thing to remember that you can't just focus professional development for teachers on cognitive development. For example, sometimes teachers are limited in their own repertoire to negotiate differences with their colleagues, to work collaboratively. So how are they going to be able to create environments in which they do that if their own professional development doesn't help them do that? And I think you can look at, I would say that all the programs that we studied in many ways were exemplary, and that they were already doing that. They were basically teaching in the way they were expecting that teachers would teach, providing them an experience that would help them develop holistically. I think one of the great lessons during the COVID pandemic, I spent a lot of time studying what impact COVID was having on educators and on students. And if there is one thing that we learned during that time, is that nobody learns very much when they're afraid, when they're anxious, when they're stressed out, whether it's students or teachers. So I think the current emphasis that we see around the world in emotional well-being, to a great extent, is a silver lining of the current pandemic that made it so visible how in the aftermath we had to do better than we had been doing previously to that. I have not studied myself programs that are designed to develop the well-being of teachers, but it's important. I mean, how often, when I said the system needs to create the enabling conditions for teachers to do their work, some of that begins with simple things. In Paraguay, when we said, let's give some time for the teachers to discuss with each other exemplars in their own schools that work, you have to give time. This shouldn't be in the personal time of the teachers. How often we ask teachers to do things that are unsustainable because they require them to do the work of a reform as a second job in their evenings, in their weekends, and so on. So I think part of making sure teaching a profession is building it so that people can do this work well. What was your second question, Mariana? Or maybe I already asked it.
It was focused on how can we create a more physical, active children and using sports for change in schools.
Obviously, I think it's good to remember that educating the whole child is about creating opportunities for the development of a range of things. Exposing students to the arts, giving them opportunities to learn different arts, providing opportunities for students to connect with the outside world, building programs that help them see the connection between what happens in the community, in the village, and what they're learning in school. And also help them move and help develop. I can tell you I have not studied this as formally as I have studied these other programs that I described. But I can tell you, as the father of an athlete who has spent much more time than I thought I was going to spend watching my son play competitive first basketball and then ultimate frisbee, that I have concluded that sports, especially team sports, are a phenomenal way to develop a range of social skills and also emotional skills, what we call sportsmanship, which is an attitude in life. I find that at least in the United States is much better developed through sports when they're well taught than through the academic classrooms. I'll conclude with this. I once asked my son, he's now a neuroscientist, finishing a PhD at Harvard Medical School, but he's still a coach in his ultimate frisbee team and a captain of the team. I once asked him, Pablo, what do you think? You're spending so many hours in these sports. What do you think you're going to learn that will have lasting value, when you become an old man like me? He thought for a moment and he said, Dad, I have learned to pass the ball. Playing in a team is never just about you. It's about the team. And in order for a team to win, you have to know how to pass the ball. And to pass the ball, you have to know your other team members. You have to know the opponents. And you have to know when to pass the ball. And I thought that was pretty deep. I may one day use that as a title for a book. You have to learn to pass the ball.
I can see that book already. Thank you very much, Fernando and Professor, for the question on teacher well-being. And I think also for not just for teachers but also for students to have that holistic exposure. And then I'm also excited to see that next year, for example, when the new Form 1 students will be having music in secondary schools, these are things that we are trying to advance to create that holistic environment for our kids. I'd like to open the room. We've heard from Mariana, who's from the Nicole David Foundation. I would like to also open up the space if any teachers or any architects. Ooh, Dato Martini. Yes, please. Oh, just press onto it, and then once it's green, that means it's working.
Ta-da!
The beauty of technology.
Thank you. Hi, Professor. Just in terms of clarification, I wanted to be a teacher since I was 6 years old, and by the time I got my doctorate at Teachers College at Columbia, I decided I didn't want to be a teacher anymore and went into non-profit. But having come from that background and trying to look at the glass as half empty and half full, I have a question for you. Malaysia, like many other countries, keep defaulting to this whole cascade training like you were mentioning because it's convenient. And how do we sort of push or get the ministry and the practitioners to abandon this whole idea of cascading training to one where we actually reward, and I love and reward the Teachers Prize Foundation as an example, but how do we get them, the ministry and the practitioners, to abandon what is easiest to do, what is needed? Because that seems to be an issue. And for all the reasons that you mentioned. And in your study, has any of the 6 countries that you mentioned actually made that transition from cascading training to actually implementing the change?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'd say the answer to your question is math. Very simple. Governments often make decisions about pursuing option A relative to option B because they think it is cost effective. Cost effective is a ratio, effectiveness divided by unit cost. And the evidence on cascade training is that, for the most part, it works like a broken telephone. Every additional layer that you include further distorts the message until it gets closer to the school. There are good reviews of research on teacher professional development, and you won't be surprised to find that most programs of professional development have an effectiveness of 0. So no matter how limited the cost is, no matter how little the denominator is, if the numerator is 0, the cost effectiveness of something that is not effective is always going to be 0. And so that's why I think math is the answer. Yes, there are many systems that have transition, and the examples that we share are, for the most part, examples that for the most part involve an organization that works as a knowledge mobilizer, that works with a network of schools over an extended period of time, creating multiple forms of PD during the school day. Now, who that organization is depends. In China, it's a normal school. It's a teacher preparation institution. In other countries, it's an organization of civil society. But in all of them, it's not just the blind leading the blind. It's not just the teachers improvising how to improve their own capacities. There is an architecture through which there is expertise external to the school that is brought to bear in supporting this work that happens in the school, and that can then have the capacity to gain knowledge from the network and quickly feed it back to the entire network. So I think that there are numerous models from which to learn, but I'd say the basic way to get people, I have found I teach a course on education policy, and I teach a unit in which I tell the students, I'm going to tell you how to make money, and they all love it. I say, because one of the hardest things when you're a minister of education is that you basically need to make very good friends with the Minister of Finance. And the Minister of, and the Minister of Finance doesn't always see things the way you do. The Minister of Finance is going to be very interested in those ratios. To a Minister of Finance, if you tell them a teacher professional development program costs $300 per teacher and another one costs $1 per teacher, which one do you think they're going to choose? Unless you show them the math. And I think once you show them the math and you show them, so teaching my students to make money in those conversations is about doing something very simple, something called cohort flow models, in which you take the existing repetition and dropout rates of a system, you take a cohort of 1,000 students, and you model what's going to happen to those students over time. In most systems, you have fairly high levels of grade retention. Why do you have grade retention? Because the students are not learning what they are supposed to. And so when you do a student flow model, you realize that only half of the kids in your average system are going to complete 6 grades in 6 years. The rest are going to need 7, 8, 9 years. That is the cost of inefficiency. So once you have these flow models, you can then say, okay, let me now show you what a system that actually built the skills to reduce the rates of repetition could save the system. And ministers of finance love it. When you tell them how you're going to save money, even in the short term, it means you have to spend more to fund those programs. So I think it's basically doing the math.
Next question, Anna. I think we only have time for 2 more questions, so we'll start with Anna first.
represent the Global Institute for Shaping a Better Future. I want to start by commending my Excellency the Minister and the Ministry of Education for such an ambitious blueprint, and also Professor Reimers. I had the chance to meet with you last week at the Better Future Forum of the Global Institute, and one of the things that struck me is, everyone's talking about AI, and sometimes it's talking about AI with some fear about replacing teachers, replacing other parts of education. And I just wonder, how do you think we can leverage very strategically AI to actually foster this teacher development that you were talking about?
So one of the findings, what we did in this book, which you can all download and which I understand one university here is going to translate in Malay, is we did something very simple. We said the question about AI in education is not about whether it can produce some innovation, whether it can produce something shiny that moves. We don't need to do a study to conclude that yes, it can do that. The relevant question is, can it transform a system? And to transform a system is to take the most important problems of the system and solve them. So transform a system in the Global South means to solve the problem of access. We still have 240 million kids who don't go to school. To make sure they learn the basics, to make the system more effective at what it does, and to make the system more relevant, to help teach the things that it's not teaching. So with those questions in mind, we then said, okay, let's examine the evidence of how AI is being used, what the evidence shows about those uses, and what the implications of that review are for policymakers, for practitioners, for researchers, and for developers. So here's a high-level finding. Most of the action with AI in education at the moment is in building chatbots to personalize learning, as in adjusting the speed at which children learn different things, which may be fine, but there is a lot of opportunity not yet exploited. When I think about an education system, I think about an inverted pyramid. At the top, what is most important is the base of the pyramid. And the base of the pyramid are students, teachers, and content interacting so that students develop more capacities. The next level, which sustains that, which enables that, are teachers. The way in which they're selected, prepared, supported to create conditions. The next level of the pyramid supporting that are the leaders of the schools and the way in which schools are organized. And then below that is what I have called the missing middle, is the entire administration from the district supervisor all the way to the person working in the office of the minister, whose job really should be in service of that base of the pyramid. So when I look at where the action is in AI at the moment, it's at the base of the pyramid. There is almost no use of AI to support the management of the system, the governance of the system, where I think is the greatest potential. Let me give you an example. In many countries in the Global South, when a teacher leaves her post, the ministry takes months to replace that person. And they may replace it with someone who doesn't have the knowledge and the skills to teach what that teacher was teaching. So a math teacher leaves and they're replaced with a language teacher. And that is a problem that can be immediately solved, building an AI-supported system to make teacher allocations and to make the system more transparent. So that's just one example. At the school level, I'll give you an example of something that a group did. They convened a group of school principals from Latin America for 3 days. Day one, they said, what are the biggest problems that you have in your schools and that you wish you had a superpower to address? So for example, they said, I spend so much of my time passing papers up and down, responding to administrative demands that I don't have time to sit in a classroom and observe how my teachers are doing. And I don't have any time to work with my teachers organizing school-based professional development, even though I know I should be doing that. So the second day of that 3-day workshop, they were taught to do prompt engineering, simple prompt engineering. And the third day, they were told, okay, now engineer some solutions to your problems. So for example, principals have to write lots of memoranda to different people, often about the same thing. So you can use an AI very nicely. You don't need to build a bot to write one time and then say, now give me a version of these for the school district supervisor, give me a version of these for the teachers, give me a version of that for the parents. And you can reduce a task that may take 2 hours a week to 30 minutes a week. So the question is, what do you do with the 90 minutes that you have saved? And so it's not just saving the 90 minutes, it's can you now use that to support teacher development at the school level? So for me, the bottom line is, I think there is I think we have the priorities in the wrong place. when most of the action on AI is building chatbots to serve students in systems where teachers are not prepared, most students don't have access to connectivity or to devices. So that kind of effort is only going to amplify existing inequalities. It's going to work for the schools that have the better prepared teachers, connectivity, and so on. When we could be using AI to support the governance of the system, the organization of the schools, the leadership of the schools, and the preparation of the teachers. And in the book there are a number of examples. But I have to say, Anna, that our conclusion, I don't come here as a techno-optimist thinking that AI is going to transform education for the following reason. In 1980, when I was still doing my undergraduate studies in psychology in Venezuela, I was studying instructional psychology, I discovered my first computer. It was a computer produced by Radio Shack called the TRS-80. It was a simple device you could buy for $100 at that time, in which you could code using the language BASIC. So I taught myself how to code in BASIC. You could connect that to a television screen. And if you wanted to save, it was basically a CPU. You had to connect this to a cassette recorder, and through a series of beeps, like Morse code, you could save your program. So I connected what I was learning about instructional psychology, and I coded, I remember, a little clown that could teach you basic math, addition and multiplication and so on. And I remember finishing my undergraduate thesis, in which I reviewed the existing research on instructional psychology, learning psychology, saying these new gadgets that have just come around are going to transform education because they're going to make it possible to personalize instruction. I realize now, more than 40 years later, how much I didn't know and how wrong I was. Computers, microcomputers, did not transform education at scale. And so I find myself today looking at this new technology and remembering the little clown I coded and saying, this could be a fad. It is a powerful technology. It is going to transform many things. Whether it transforms education or not, I think depends on whether we deploy it to solve the really important problems and not to do the equivalent of the clown that I myself coded a long time ago.
Thank you very much, Professor. Due to time constraints, we only have time for one last question. I'll open to Cikgu Jerome.
Right, thank you so much. And I would like to take this opportunity to compliment our Minister and also Ministry of Education for really pushing forward the agenda of sustainability in our education system. So thank you so much. And in the meantime, I would like to ask, on my curiosity, from all the countries that Prof have gone through previously and shared previously and also been seen in other countries, is there any countries that have successfully pushing forward the agenda of sustainability or climate change education? And maybe is there any G's that we can learn from in order to push this agenda forward in these coming 10 years? Thank you.
Let me answer in two parts. I often get asked, journalists and so on, what are the best countries in education in the world? And I think that's the wrong question. It's a useless question. I don't believe there is a best education country because I believe that in any country there is excellence. And the task of research is to find that excellence within that place and elsewhere. So I just gave you two examples of good practices that I observed in the country of Paraguay or Mexico, none of which would probably be recognized by you or others as top performing countries. I'm sure that if I spent some time researching your system, I would find excellent things in your system. I believe the same is true in this book that we just published last Monday on education for a climate change future. We do look at a range of countries and we look at government initiatives, but we also look at initiatives of networks to support a sustainability agenda. And what you find is that there are excellent practices in many different places. I am at the moment working with colleagues in 15 different countries doing in-depth studies of that two-way relationship between education and climate change in those 15 countries. And it would be easy for me to tell you Finland is doing great, but that's only because that's the only paper that is finished out of the 15. I'm sure that when all the other papers are finished, I would find similarly interesting things happening in other places. So I think that we can learn from global experience. I guess I would summarize saying that in my own work studying the process of change in education systems, I have learned that change comes from four places. It comes from governments. Governments are very important. And most people who study change, including myself, what we study is what governments do. But that's not the only source of change. Change also comes from networks, and that has been largely understudied. And what I'm finding as I'm looking at the role of networks, for example, right now in climate change, is that we know so little about how powerful those networks can be in producing change. Networks understood not as collections. I was talking to the director of Fulbright about, I serve on an advisory committee to the Fulbright program in DC. And we have remarkably few studies that have examined the impact of that program, which I know anecdotally has been transformational in many societies. When you look at the people who went through that program and the positions they went into and how they collaborated and so on. So networks are the second source. The third source of transformation, in my experience, are just innovators. Maria Montessori, for example, is a woman who began teaching children who were institutionalized in mental health institutions. And out of her work and her commitment to the most marginalized kids, she began a movement that has transformed how many people do education. At the time before she lived, in the 1800s, there was a group of educators that organized what was then called the École Nouvelle, the New School in France. And they convened individuals such as those, and they began what we now recognize as the movement for student-centered learning. That's where it began. So this was not an initiative from government. It was not an initiative from organized networks. It was just individuals who did. I'll give you another example, Pestalozzi, which I know well. I have a great, Pestalozzi decided at his time that we had to educate orphans because they were the most vulnerable people in Switzerland where he lived. And at that time, orphans, for the most part, were the children of people who had died in a war. And at that time, when the father died, the mother often found herself unable to take care of the kids, so they put them in an institution. So Pestalozzi developed a way to educate those children, and he developed very powerful ideas that have resonance even today. For example, the idea that humans develop in different stages, and education has to be attuned to the stage of the individual. The idea that the goal of education was to develop the whole potential of people, not just a narrow set of skills. The idea that people had to learn to make a living. So I have a great-great-grandfather who was an orphan in Switzerland. His father died in a civil war, and he went to one of the schools set up by Pestalozzi. And it changed his life, because he learned how to be a gardener. Had it not been because of Pestalozzi, I wouldn't be where I am. My great-great-grandfather would not have learned. He would have probably been a beggar or something like that in his society. So individuals. And then lastly, ideas can have tremendous power, not just individuals, just ideas, which is why one of my favorite things to do when I teach every class is, and I welcome my students, is I give them a pen. And I tell them, this is one of the most powerful tools ever invented. It is a mind-expanding tool because it allows you to put down your thoughts. And when you can put down your thoughts, you can look at them and change them. Other people can look at them, and you can talk to people who will never meet you through that act of writing your thoughts. So I think those are the four sources of change. In this room, we probably only recognize one, which is governments. They're important, but it's not the only one. It's good to remember that.